Conservation capital focuses on a very particular niche in the conservation development world. It's about the role and potential of commercial business and the commercial money that finances those commercial businesses in conservation. I guess that 10 or 15 years ago that would have been an unusual notion. Conservation has traditionally been financed with government development money, philanthropy. There are a whole wide variety of ways in which a business can positively impact conservation, and that's what we focus on developing, and increasingly now focusing on exploiting new financial markets to develop those. We started in East Africa. It's my home, in Kenya. But we now operate along a sort of European African axis in over 25 countries. We've developed projects now. Still learning a lot, made a few mistakes along the way, but that's as healthy as having a success as long as you learn from it. And yeah, it's exciting. Well, I guess personally, the reason I'm involved in this field at all is purely because I have a passion for wilderness and wildlife. I guess that comes from the area where I was brought up. I don't think that's necessarily unusual. I find it difficult to understand anyone who isn't drawn to beautiful scenery and nature and wildlife. So for me, I guess the first point is I just look at it in those terms. Professionally, however, I've now developed a way of life and a business that looks at ways of using business to help preserve those landscapes where they need to be preserved. And unfortunately, there's more and more pressure on them, so there's more of a need to engage and to intervene. So yes, on the one hand, I have the indulgence of simply appreciating these landscapes for what they are, but increasingly I find myself trying to work out ways in which it can be used responsibly to develop businesses that can help support that, whether it's tourism. Increasingly there's, certainly in developing nations, there's increasing pressure on these landscapes from the need to produce more food to feed a growing world population. I personally am not an agricultural expert, but I'm having to not necessarily become an expert, but having to learn fast because while tourism has been a traditional and more obvious model, I think the future of enterprise is going to lie much more heavily in managing and manipulating the way agriculture works to try and ensure that it doesn't conflict with nature. A lot of what we have to do involves trying to find investors to invest in projects and develop them. And I've learned that if you try and do that in a grey office in New York or London or wherever you are, your chances of success are considerably less than if you put them into these environments. And to some extent, it's almost like a drug, and we exploit it. It affected my life, one of those moments, and we use it to affect many others. There are many things we look at in determining whether a business opportunity can be developed, and particularly if that business opportunity can help conservation in any way. In fact, we've developed a framework of about 70 different criteria, which I won't go through now, but there are some that are inevitably more important, more significant than others. They're all important. The first thing is that we operate in a world where everyone has constrained resources. There's constrained money, there's constrained time, constrained people. So it's really important that we focus on areas which I call are relevant in conservation terms. And if they're going to be relevant in conservation terms, you need high value natural assets that you're looking to protect or need protection. By definition, if they're a priority, they need to be threatened. If they weren't threatened, you could argue that leave it alone and it's fine, move somewhere else. And in particular, projects which will help an area where if you help that area, it will have a bigger impact on a wider area. So for example, wildlife corridors between different ecosystems are very important because if you shut them off, you can compromise the much bigger areas of land. So those are three things in terms of relevance. So they've got to be valuable, they've got to be threatened, and ideally they've got to be strategic in terms of if you help secure that piece of wilderness, it'll help have a beneficial impact on a much bigger area of wilderness. What I call property rights are very, very important. It's very difficult to manage conservation development unless you have the right to manage conservation development. So when you're working with local communities, it's difficult to work with them or persuade them or support them to do better things for conservation if they don't have the power over the land. So property rights are important at a conservation level. That's why I guess the easiest context in which to work are national parks, where it's owned by the government, it's been set aside for conservation, the government has the right to manage it, or even private land. These are strong property right contexts. But you also need to give the business opportunity property rights as well. So if you're developing an eco-lodge, you need to give the entrepreneur the rights to a piece of land to develop the business, and it needs to be of sufficient length and strength to give him or her the security to invest in there for the long term. So property rights, it's a rather technical area, but it's really important. Property rights are very important. Obviously the underlying product needs to be strong. If you're trying to build a tourism facility based on seeing wildlife, it's going to be easier to do if there is good wildlife to see, it's accessible, it's visible, it's charismatic. Whether or not there's a good business plan for that opportunity, whether there's a good operator who's going to execute that business plan. You can have all the other things in place, great conservation context, great underlying product, strong property rights, but if you don't have a good business plan and a good execution of that business plan, and too often that's an area that fails. When you're working with local communities, and a lot of conservation enterprises involve developing businesses where local communities have a stake, they benefit from that stake. But it can be complicated. You need local communities that are stable, not fragmented, have strong governance institutions within them. I would say that the one area that has been a struggle for us is this issue of property rights. It's complicated in Europe, much more complicated than in Africa. Property rights exist, but they're often held by governments through complicated municipal, local council vehicles. It's proving a little harder than we've experienced elsewhere in the world to get a local council or to work with a national park authority to think about the idea of say, creating a 30-year lease over a tourism development site. So that's the one area that I would say we're finding a bit more challenging here. It's possibly also a result of the fact that the European context is new for us, so we have to learn a lot more. The other area is ironically, entrepreneurial culture. Clearly there's a strong entrepreneurial culture in Europe, but we're not seeing that much evidence of it in the context of wilderness. There are operators out there who've developed businesses based on nature, but there aren't big operators and bigger businesses that the sorts of businesses we would connect with in African context to try and or connect those businesses to conservation context to develop enterprise opportunities. Obviously, from a tourism perspective, you don't have the abundance of wildlife, but part of the whole point of the Rewilding Europe project is to rectify that. But that's a 10, 20, 30, 50-year project. So it's going to be time before you have, one of the mantras or the bylines in Rewilding Europe is to create the Serengetis and the Yellowstones of Europe. The physical environment exists there, the landscapes exist, but the wildlife content it also exists, but you have to work hard to find it, and the abundance isn't there, the visibility isn't there. So it's a mix. Some of it's there, some of it's proving more challenging to develop. Fire Brava is one of the better examples of a site or a project with which we can work in terms of these raw materials or these ingredients being in place. In terms of entrepreneurial spirit, it's very much driven by entrepreneurial spirit. The origins of Fire Brava are a group of enthusiastic individuals who fell in love with this area, saw the opportunity and value of the Coa Valley, and set about the very difficult task of raising money to buy land. And it's a complicated process because land here is owned in very small parcels, and I don't know how many transactions they've done, but it could amount to the hundreds. And that requires dedication and spirit. So I think the entrepreneurial culture is there, at least on the conservation side. What it does do, though, is it creates this property right context that I mentioned, where this is a rare example so far of a piece of wilderness real estate which is in private hands. There's a clearly defined owner who holds those rights and with which we can work. And so that is one of the reasons we're focusing first on this, because this property right context exists. That's a fundamental prerequisite both for conservation development and enterprise development. One of the challenges in a European context is the lack of abundance of wildlife. But I emphasize that doesn't mean that the wildlife product is less compelling or indeed less marketable. In an African context, if you look at the more famous, celebrated, charismatic areas, the reason they're successful from a tourism perspective is that you can arrive in the Masai Mara or the Serengeti or the Kruger National Park and you will see lions, leopards, elephants, herds of wildebeest, and that's obviously a powerful draw. But there is an element of that which perhaps some of the more sophisticated tourists that we've had or come across in Africa don't find so compelling. I mean, once you've seen it, you've seen it. It's always great seeing it, but some of the more compelling tourism products in Africa involve perhaps a bit of effort in finding wildlife. So it might be looking for wild dog, which have in some parts of Kenya have become very difficult to see, and tourists will go to great lengths. Along the way, they might see some of the more obvious species, but when you eventually find that wild dog, it's an incredible experience. And if you start developing a product around the process of finding the wild dog, tracking it, great guiding, great information, you can develop a product out of the making about seeing something that's hard to see. In terms of developing conservation enterprise in and around Fire Brava, the challenge is that from a tourism front in particular, this is not a well-known part of the world. There is a tourism industry here. It's small, it's very domestic. We're sitting here in this incredible facility, Casa Cisterna, and this old medieval fortified mountain hilltop village. It's great, but it's one product, and it's fantastic if you live nearby and can come here for the weekend. I don't think that it's a product that will draw people from London or from further afield, Paris, Amsterdam, America maybe. And there are other products that are around and about, but what we need to do is to develop a sense of a destination here, and ideally a destination that is strongly associated with wilderness and Fire Brava in particular. So what we're doing, or trying to do, is to put together a network of semi-linked business opportunities. I have to emphasize it's early days, so we've got a lot of due diligence to go through before we can finalize this. But one of the things that we are thinking about developing is the idea of an eco lodge or a tented camp in Fire Brava that would be kind of African-esque safari style in feeling. But even that alone, it's just one product in a remote part of Europe, which is not yet known. But if we start to link that product maybe with Kaiserslautern, and there's a development project going on here in order to increase the capacity here, which we are looking at potentially supporting. Suddenly you have 2 products, and it might be possible to come and stay in this cool boutique village hilltop hotel for a night or 2 nights, mixed with a night or 2 nights in Fire Brava in the tented camp. I emphasise early days, a long way to go, but if you look hard enough, there are ideas out there, and so branded wine, adventure racing, tented camps, fly camps, bush dinners, cool boutique hotels. If you connect the dots, you might have the basis of doing something much more interesting and overcoming that initial problem that no one knows about this part of Portugal, no one knows about Fire Brava, and therefore it's difficult to persuade people to come here. We need to build a product, and good products are often a collection of products, and so that's our strategy at this stage. So the focus at the end of the day is always going to be, from our perspective, on how does this all tie back to rewilding. Now, there are many people that have different interpretations of rewilding. I take a simple view is that natural processes, natural wildlife that would have lived here does so again. All those processes exist again. And so part of that is going to involve raising money to buy land, support certain activities related to rewilding. You know, there's still bits of research that need to be done. I was having a discussion yesterday with Giles about possible reintroduction of wild species, and there are various species on the list, but more research needs to be done to work out A, whether it's appropriate, and B, to help build the arguments in order to get the permissions that you require to do this kind of thing now. So from our perspective, we are, that's the end game, but there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on around that, which is partly linked, not necessarily exclusively linked to Fire Brava, but if we bring together, will help support the economic process that inevitably underlies a lot of these projects, rewilding or conservation or however you want to call it. It costs money, and we need to help use business to fund that. In terms of my ideal vision for the future of Fire Brava in this area, firstly, I would like to see much more land secured for conservation. So really an extension of the process that has already started here in Fire Brava and Campaneris at the other end of the corridor, as it were. And I would like to see much more wildlife here. I accept that that's going to take time, but in order for that to happen, you need to create the platform for wildlife to be here, and that's putting more land under conservation, effective conservation. And given what we do, I hope that there will be one day a variety of meaningful businesses, directly or indirectly, supporting the economics of all that, because inevitably there's an economic equation involved in much of rewilding or conservation, and that's our job. Our job is to build those businesses and to build the revenue flows that will help pay for it all.